They had come for samples and quick reconnaissance. They got neither. The first spear whistled past Steve's head and shattered against a rock with explosive force. "Contact!" Seble shouted, raising her pulse rifle. From the ridgeline above them poured the axe-heads, a furious flock of avian aliens 6 feet tall and terrifyingly graceful. Their bodies were slender and powerful, covered in vibrant red and gold feathers that flashed like flames against the dark stone. Their heads were shaped like axe blades, sharp and elongated, topped with fierce mohawks of stiff feathers. Round, predatory eyes locked onto their prey with unnatural focus. Curved beaks clicked with rage, and their clawed hands and feet gripped the volcanic rock as if it were nothing. They moved like living lightning. Seble and Steve opened fire. Blue energy bolts streaked through the ash-filled air, but the axe-heads were impossibly fast. They flipped, twisted, and dodged mid-sprint, their slender bodies bending like reeds in a hurricane. Not a single shot landed. "Impossible!" Steve growled, firing again. One axe-head leaped from a 30-foot ledge, feathers flaring, and hurled a spear with terrifying precision. The weapon slammed into Seble's chest with enough force to crack stone. Her nano-suit absorbed the impact, flashing a warning across her, HUD, but the blow still knocked her backward. "They're too fast!" she shouted. The axe-heads closed the distance in heartbeats, screeching high-pitched battle cries that echoed across the mountains. Their claws scraped sparks from the rock as they sprinted. Steve grabbed Seble's arm and pulled her into a desperate run down the steep volcanic slope. Lava glowed on both sides of their narrow path. One wrong step meant instant death. Behind them, the flock poured down the mountain like a wave of red death. Spear after spear flew. One grazed Steve's shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Another struck Seble's leg, nearly tripping her. The nano-suits held, but the impacts were brutal, jarring every bone in their bodies. "There!" Steve pointed ahead. "Lava tube!" A dark, jagged opening yawned in the mountainside, an ancient tunnel left by flowing magma. They sprinted for it, sliding down the final loose scree slope and diving inside just as a volley of spears clattered against the entrance. Inside the lava tube, the world became narrow, dark, and suffocating. The walls were smooth black glass, still warm from ancient heat. The axe-heads shrieked outside, furious they could not fit their broad shoulders and axe-shaped heads into the tight passage. "Keep moving," Seble urged, her voice echoing. They crouched and ran deeper into the tunnel, hearts pounding, breaths ragged. The ground trembled faintly from distant eruptions. For a moment, they allowed themselves to hope. That hope died when they reached the far end. Dozens of axe-heads were already waiting at the tunnel's exit, perched on rocks like vultures, spears raised, eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. They had circled around the mountain faster than humanly possible. "Trapped," Steve whispered. The axe-heads began advancing into the mouth of the tube, claws scraping glass-like stone. Their feathers bristled, beaks clicked. Seble's mind raced, then Steve's eyes lit up. "Back the way we came, and there was a crack halfway through. I saw light." They spun and sprinted back into the darkness. The axe-heads gave chase, screeching, their claws clicking rapidly against the tunnel floor. The sound was horrifyingly close. Steve spotted the faint beam of light, cutting through a fracture in the ceiling. "Cover me!" he shouted. Seble turned and fired repeatedly down the tunnel, forcing the axe-heads to dodge and slow. Steve slapped a small explosive charge into the crack, set the timer, and yelled, "Go!" They ran. The explosion roared behind them. Rock shattered. The crack widened violently into a jagged opening just big enough for a person. No time to think. They climbed out and froze. They had emerged on the edge of a sheer cliff. Hundreds of feet below, a river of glowing lava snaked through the valley. Behind them, the axe heads were already climbing through the new opening, furious and closing fast. "No choice!" Steve yelled. They jumped. The fall was terrifying. Wind howled past their helmets. The ground rushed up. At the last second, their nano suits inflated into protective cocoons, absorbing the brutal impact as they tumbled and rolled across the rocky slope. Bruised, but alive, they scrambled to their feet. Seble lifted her binoculars and scanned the ridge above. Her stomach dropped. "The axe heads have split into 2 groups," she said urgently. "One is coming down after us. The other is heading straight for the lander." Steve's face hardened. "They're trying to trap us here." They broke into a dead sprint across the volcanic terrain, leaping over glowing cracks, dodging falling ash and sliding down steep slopes. Every breath burned. Their suits were scarred and scorched. Behind them, the pursuing axe heads bounded from rock to rock, gaining ground with terrifying speed. Seble tried to remote start the lander. "Out of range!" she shouted. The lander sat on a distant plateau, vulnerable. If the second group reached it first, Seble and Steve would be stranded on this deadly world forever. The chase intensified. Spears whistled past them. One axe head leaped from a cliff edge above, soaring like a red demon, claws extended. Steve fired upward, mid-run, forcing it to twist away at the last second. The volcanic mountain rumbled ominously, as if the planet itself wanted them dead. Seble and Steve ran harder than they had ever run in their lives, hearts thundering, lungs burning, with an entire flock of axe-headed death closing in from 2 directions. The volcanic world roared around them like an angry god. Seble and Steve sprinted across the jagged black ridges, lungs burning, legs screaming with exhaustion. Behind them, the first group of axe heads bounded down the slope like crimson lightning, leaping from rock to rock with impossible agility. Their colourful feathers flashed in the hellish glow of flowing lava, their axe-shaped heads cutting through the ash-filled air as they closed the distance. "Faster!" Steve shouted. The lander sat on a distant plateau, a silver disk glinting against the blood-red sky. But as they drew closer, dread hit them both at once. The second group had already arrived. Dozens of axe heads swarmed around their craft, spears raised, talons scraping across the hull as they searched for a way inside. One of them slammed a spear against the landing gear with such force it left a visible dent. Seble skidded to a stop on the ridgeline. "They're already there." Steve didn't hesitate. He activated the remote override on his wrist display. The lander's engines hummed to life, slowly lifting off the plateau. But the terrain was treacherous. Sharp volcanic spines and sheer drops surrounded them. The craft could not land close enough without risking a crash. "Damn it! Too jagged!" Steve growled. A blood-chilling screech echoed behind them. The pursuing axe heads had caught up. Spears rained down like deadly hail. One slammed into Seble's back, the impact throwing her forward. Another struck Steve's thigh, spinning him halfway around. The nano-suits held, but the sheer kinetic force felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. "Steve, I'm getting tired," Seble gasped, her breathing ragged. The constant running, the heat, the adrenaline, it was draining her faster than she could recover. Steve's face hardened with determination. "Then we do this the hard way." He guided the lander remotely, bringing the craft dangerously close along the narrow ridge. With expert precision, he dropped it below the ridgeline, tilting the entire vessel sideways so the open hatch faced them like a gaping mouth. "Get ready to jump." The axe heads were only seconds away, leaping from boulder to boulder, spears already drawn back for the kill. "Now!" Steve roared. Seble and Steve sprinted the final distance and leaped off the edge of the cliff. For one terrifying heartbeat, they were airborne, the glowing lava river far below. They sailed straight into the open hatch of the tilted lander. They crashed hard inside the cargo bay, tumbling across the deck. A split second later, a spear shot through the open door like a missile, embedding itself deep into the opposite wall just inches from Seble's head. The axe head that threw it shrieked in rage from the ridge above. "Close the hatch!" Seble yelled. Steve slammed the remote command. The door hissed shut, just as more spears clattered uselessly against the hull. The lander's engines screamed as they accelerated away, leaving the furious flock behind. They didn't stop to celebrate. "Take us to the other side of the planet," Seble said, collapsing into the co-pilot seat. "Maybe the inhabitants there are more peaceful." Steve nodded grimly and piloted the craft high above the volcanic hellscape. The planet was massive and violently active, but as they crossed to the far hemisphere, the landscape changed. The volcanoes gave way to darker, colder mountains shrouded in thick mist. They set the lander down in a narrow valley beside an absolutely colossal rock formation, a single, sheer pillar of black stone rising like a skyscraper from the earth. Its walls were nearly vertical, impossibly smooth and steep. Climbing it by hand would be suicide. "Let's send the drone up," Steve suggested. "We need to know what's on top before we go exploring." The small reconnaissance drone hummed upward, its camera feeding live images to their console. As it reached the summit, they both leaned in closer. On top of the skyscraper-like rock was a massive nest, a carefully constructed platform of sharp sticks pointing outward like a crown of thorns, topped with a thick bed of dry grass and leaves. Curled protectively in the centre was a single female axe head. Her feathers were a softer shade of crimson and gold. She was curled tightly around a large, speckled egg, her axe-shaped head resting gently against it. "It's a nest," Seble whispered. The female axe head suddenly stirred. Her round eyes snapped open with predatory alertness. In one fluid motion she snatched a spear from the edge of the nest and hurled it with terrifying accuracy. The drone camera exploded in a shower of sparks. The feed went dead. Steve cursed, frantically guiding the damaged drone back down. It spun wildly but managed to limp back into the lander's cargo bay. "That was a warning shot," Seble said. Before they could react, the female axe head let out a piercing, haunting bird-like call that echoed across the mountains. The sound was answered from multiple directions. "They're coming," Steve said. They quickly stepped outside to collect surface samples, working as fast as possible. The air was cooler here, but tension hung thick. Seble had just sealed a rock sample when the ground began to tremble, not from a volcano, but from hundreds of clawed feet. A massive war party of axe heads burst over the nearest ridge, feathers blazing, spears raised high. Their battle cries shook the valley. "Back to the lander!" Steve shouted. The chase was on again. Seble and Steve sprinted toward their craft as the axe heads poured down the slopes from all sides. Spears whistled past them, some bouncing off their suits. One axe head took a daring leap from a high ledge, landing directly in front of Seble. She fired her pulse rifle at point-blank range. The creature twisted at the last millisecond, the bolt burning only a few feathers, then slashed at her with razor claws. Steve tackled the axe head from the side, buying Seble a precious second. They both dove into the lander. Steve slammed the hatch shut as spears hammered against the hull like machine gun fire. "Get us out of here!" Seble yelled. The engines roared. The lander lifted violently, scraping against the skyscraper rock as they climbed. Below them, the axe heads screeched in fury, leaping desperately into the air as if they could still reach them. As the craft climbed higher into the red sky, Seble stared down at the retreating figures. "These aren't just warriors," she said quietly. "They're defending their homes, their children." Steve gripped the controls tightly. "Then let's not give them a reason to follow us any further." The lander streaked away from the towering nest rock, leaving the axe heads and their volcanic world behind. The volcanic fury of the axe-head continent faded behind them as Steve pushed the lander across the planet's curvature. They flew low over a vast, restless ocean, the largest body of water they had ever seen on any world. Towering waves crashed against jagged black shores while steam rose where lava met seawater. After hours of tense silence, a lone island appeared on the horizon, a green jewel surrounded by violent surf. "No axe-heads," Seble said, scanning the terrain. "This might be our chance to breathe." They set the lander down on a black sand beach nestled between two steep cliffs. The air was heavy with salt and strange floral perfume. Towering palm-like trees with blood-red fronds swayed gently. For the first time since landing on this nightmare planet, everything felt almost peaceful. They stepped out cautiously, weapons ready, and began collecting samples, exotic plants, strange minerals, and water from a crystal-clear stream. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing disturbed them. Then came the humming. At first, it sounded like distant insects. Then it grew louder, a high-pitched, vibrating drone that filled the air. Seble looked up. The sky above the tree line was darkening, not with clouds, with creatures. Hundreds of hummingbird-like aliens swarmed toward them. Each one was the size of a large hawk, with iridescent metallic feathers that shifted between deep crimson and electric violet. Their long, needle-sharp beaks gleamed like surgical blades. Tiny red eyes locked onto Seble and Steve with ravenous hunger. These were not birds, they were bloodsuckers. "Back to the lander!" Steve shouted. The swarm descended like a living storm. Seble and Steve sprinted across the black sand as the hummingbirds dove at terrifying speed. One latched onto Steve's shoulder, its beak piercing the nano-suit's outer layer before he ripped it off and crushed it under his boot. Another stabbed at Seble's neck. She spun and fired her pulse rifle on wide dispersal, burning several out of the air in a flash of blue light. But there were too many. The creatures moved with impossible agility, darting and hovering like living bullets. Their high-pitched screeches mixed with the constant vibrating hum created a disorienting wall of sound. One landed on Seble's helmet, its beak scraping loudly against her visor as it tried to find a weak point. She slammed her head against a tree trunk to dislodge it. "They're after blood!" she yelled. Steve grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a narrow ravine between the cliffs. "This way! Tighter space!" They sprinted into the ravine as the swarm poured in after them. The walls were steep and covered in slick moss. Spears of sunlight cut through the canopy above. The hummingbirds attacked from every angle, diving, stabbing, trying to drain them dry. Steve fired blindly behind them while running, lighting up the ravine with pulse fire. Burnt hummingbirds rained down around them. Seble's suit began flashing multiple breach warnings. Small punctures were appearing. She could feel warm blood trickling down her arm from a successful stab. "We're not going to make it back to the lander like this," she shouted. Steve spotted a narrow cave opening halfway up the ravine wall. "Up there!" They climbed desperately, hands slipping on wet rock, as the swarm swirled below them like a living tornado. Steve boosted Seble up, then pulled himself in after her. They crawled deep into the narrow cave, just wide enough for their bodies. The hummingbirds tried to follow, but couldn't fit more than a few at a time. Steve blasted the entrance repeatedly until the swarm finally retreated, screeching in frustration. They waited in the darkness, breathing hard, listening to the angry hum outside. After nearly an hour, the sound finally faded. They emerged cautiously, made a desperate sprint across the beach, and reached the lander. The moment the hatch sealed, Steve launched them into orbit without hesitation. "Enough of this planet," he muttered. The journey back through the wormhole was quiet. When they finally docked at the International Space Station orbiting Earth, Seble felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: relief. She had spent nearly half her life on this station. These metallic corridors, the hum of life support systems, the view of the blue planet slowly turning below. It felt more like home than anywhere else in the galaxy. They walked together toward the debriefing room, suits still scorched and scarred from the axe heads and bloodsuckers. General Race was waiting, arms crossed, face stern as always. "Report," he demanded. Seble and Steve gave a full account: the hostile axeheads, their incredible speed and aggression, the blood-sucking hummingbird swarm, the narrow escapes, and the impossible terrain. Race listened, without interrupting. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This planet is to be classified as hostile," he said firmly. "No further missions, no attempts at contact. We stay clear." Seble nodded slowly. "I agree, sir." Steve glanced at her, then back at Rice. "Agreed. That world doesn't want us there, and we have no business forcing the issue." Race studied them both for a long moment, his eyes lingering on Seble a second longer than usual. "Dismissed. Get some rest. You've earned it." As they walked out of the debriefing room, Seble paused at the large observation window overlooking Earth. The blue planet glowed peacefully below them. Steve stood beside her. "Think we'll ever find a world peaceful enough for the Esist eggs?" he asked, quietly. Seble didn't answer right away. She touched the small container secured at her side, the last hope of an entire species. "I don't know," she whispered, "but we keep looking." Far behind them, on the volcanic world they had barely escaped, a lone axehead stood atop a skyscraper-like rock, watching the sky with sharp, unblinking eyes. Its feathers rippled in the wind as it let out one final, haunting cry. Some planets are not meant to be explored. They are only meant to be survived. "Left! Go left!" Steve shouted, firing his pulse rifle blindly over his shoulder. Behind them, Sherkan soldiers, towering, jade-scaled reptilian warriors in segmented battle armor, charged through the foliage with terrifying discipline. Their eyes glowed with cold intelligence. At their sides, sleek hunter drones whirred through the trees like metallic hornets, red sensor beams cutting through the gloom. A drone locked onto Seble. She dove sideways as a searing plasma bolt vaporized the tree beside her. The explosion sent glowing insects scattering in radiant panic. Steve returned fire, clipping one drone's wing and sending it spiraling into a trunk in a shower of sparks. "They're everywhere," Seble gasped, her suit shifting frantically between bronze and deep green to match the jungle. The Sherkans were relentless. One soldier leaped from a branch above, landing with a heavy thud. Its obsidian claws extended as it raised a crackling energy spear. Steve tackled Seble out of the way just as the spear embedded in the ground, erupting in a blast of superheated plasma. They rolled to their feet and kept running, hearts hammering, lungs burning in the humid, sulphur-laced air. Translucent bird-like creatures fled, screeching overhead. Swarms of glowing violet insects parted around them like living curtains. Suddenly, a figure burst from the shadows ahead, a sleek, iridescent reptilian with elongated eyes and shifting scales. "Follow me," she hissed in perfect English. "Now!" Schnecks of the Esist didn't wait for questions. She spun and sprinted deeper into the jungle with fluid grace, her form rippling as she adapted camouflage mid-stride. Seble and Steve had no choice but to follow. Schnecks led them through a hidden path of twisting roots and bioluminescent moss that glowed faintly underfoot. Behind them, Sherkan's shouts and drone engines grew louder. A plasma bolt scorched the air inches from Steve's head, setting a vine ablaze. They reached a half-buried stone structure, overgrown with vines, an ancient Esist Hideout. Schnecks slammed her clawed hand against a hidden panel. A section of the floor hissed open, revealing a narrow descending passage. "Inside!" she urged. They tumbled down into the cool, dimly lit chamber. The walls hummed with faint, mechanical energy. Schnecks sealed the entrance just as heavy footsteps and drone whine passed overhead. For a moment, there was only ragged breathing. "You are not of Slushi," Schnecks rasped, scanning them with a small device pressed to their temples. A flood of light and data surged through their minds, languages, memories, and context downloaded in seconds. Before they could speak, the hideout trembled. Drones had detected them. Pulsefire began hammering the structure from above. Cracks spider-webbed across the ceiling. Schnecks's eyes flared with urgent light. She moved to a frost-covered container in the corner and heaved it open. Inside floated 20 pale, pulsing eggs glowing with soft, inner light. "Our last generation," she said, voice thick with sorrow. "The Sherkan will finish us soon. Take them. Find them a home, please." She thrust the heavy flask into Sebele's arms, the weight of an entire species pressed against her chest. "No, come with us," Seble pleaded. Schnecks's crest lowered. "There is no time." The hideout door exploded inward. Sherkan soldiers poured in, weapons blazing. Schnecks roared and charged them, pulse rifle in hand, her form shifting mid-leap into a larger, more aggressive shape for combat. "Go!" Seble and Steve ran. They burst from the rear exit of the hideout into the jungle once more. Behind them, gunfire and screams echoed as Schnecks fought like a demon to buy them time. Drones swarmed the canopy. Sherkan soldiers crashed through the foliage in pursuit. The disc-shaped lander waited in a small clearing ahead, its hatch open like a promise of salvation. Spears of plasma ripped past them, setting trees ablaze. One bolt struck Steve's leg, staggering him. Seble pulled him forward as the lander's automated defenses opened up, laying down covering fire. They dove through the hatch. Seble sealed it as the last image burned into their minds, Schnecks standing defiantly, firing her rifle until a barrage of energy bolts cut her down in a storm of sparks and blood. "Lift off!" Steve roared, slamming the controls. The lander shuddered, engines screaming as it tore upward through the orange haze. Lightning flashed around them. Sherkan anti-air fire streaked past, one bolt grazing the wing and sending the craft into a violent spin. Steve wrestled the controls, stabilizing them just as they broke through the atmosphere into the cold blackness of space. Relief lasted only seconds. "Where's the mothership?" Seble whispered. Silence answered. Where their sleek orbital vessel had waited, only drifting wreckage remained. Twisted metal glowing faintly in the red giant's light, fragments spinning silently in the void. Seble clutched the container of Esist eggs tighter to her chest, her voice breaking. "Steve, They destroyed it, stranded in orbit around a war-torn world, carrying the last hope of a dying species, with Sherkan forces no doubt already scrambling reinforcements. The jungle far below continued to burn, stranded, alone, carrying the glowing container of 20 Esist eggs like a fragile heartbeat against her chest. Seble stared out the viewport at the burning jungle far below. "We won't last in orbit," Steve said grimly, hands tight on the lander's controls. 48 hours until the wormhole reopens. We hide on the surface. They plunged back into Slushi's thick atmosphere, this time heading for the remote southern islands, jagged volcanic rock rising from a storm-racked sea. No cities, no satellites, just wind, ash, and isolation. The lander settled on black volcanic glass amid howling gales. Glaciers loomed like broken teeth in the distance. Acid rain began to hammer the hull almost immediately, hissing and steaming on contact. For the first few hours, silence reigned. Then the nightmare truly began. A low, guttural hiss echoed from the rocks. From the shadows emerged not one, but a pack of xenomorph-like reptiles, sleek, elongated horrors with glossy black exoskeletons, elongated heads, and dripping acid saliva. Their tails whipped like living blades tipped with razor barbs. "Here we go," Steve muttered, raising his rifle. The creatures attacked with horrifying coordination. One leaped onto the lander's hull, its claws screeching against the reinforced plating. Seble fired through the open hatch, blowing its head apart in a spray of sizzling ichor. Another dropped from above, tail stabbing towards Steve's back. He spun at the last second, severing the tail with a point-blank pulse blast. The fight turned chaotic and desperate. The pack swarmed from every angle, crawling across the rocks like living shadows. Seble's suit sensors screamed warnings as acid splattered across her arm, eating slowly through the outer nanolayer. Steve was tackled by two at once, rolling across the sharp, volcanic ground as claws raked his chest plate. "Get them off me!" he roared. Seble switched her rifle to wide beam and swept the area, burning two creatures into shrieking torches. The survivors retreated momentarily into the mist, only to regroup and strike again. Every minute felt like an eternity. The eggs remained safe inside the lander, but the relentless assault was draining their ammunition and stamina. Then the ground itself began to shake. A new roar, deep, thunderous and ancient, split the storm. From behind a ridge of jagged stone rose a colossal, rhino-like behemoth. Its body was a living tank, completely encased in massive overlapping plates of scaly armor that glowed faintly with geothermal heat. Red eyes burned with primal rage. Its horn was a jagged obsidian spike longer than a man. It charged straight for the lander. "Move!" Seble yelled. The beast slammed into the side of their craft with earth-shaking force, rocking it violently and leaving a deep dent. Alarms blared inside. If it kept attacking, the lander would be destroyed. "We have to draw it away," Steve shouted. They sprinted out into the open, firing their rifles at the monster's face to enrage it. The creature bellowed and abandoned the lander, turning its full fury on the tiny humans. Its thunderous footsteps cracked the volcanic rock beneath it as it charged. Seble and Steve ran for their lives across the treacherous island terrain. Acid rain stung their visors. Winged predators circled overhead, waiting for an easy meal. The armored behemoth gained on them with terrifying speed, its plates grinding like tank treads. They led it on a deadly chase toward the island's edge, a sheer cliff, dropping hundreds of meters into a boiling sea of lava and storm waves. "Keep going," Steve urged, firing backward to keep the beast focused on them. The ground grew narrower, cracks spider-webbed beneath their feet. The cliff edge loomed ahead, glowing orange from the lava river far below. "Now!" Seble cried. They sprinted the final distance and leaped off the edge into empty space. The fall was pure terror. Wind howled. Lava glowed beneath them like the mouth of hell. At the last possible moment, their nano-suits inflated into impact cocoons, absorbing the brutal crash as they slammed into a lower ledge covered in soft ash and moss. The rhino beast, too heavy and too enraged to stop, thundered straight over the cliff. Its massive armoured body plummeted past them, roaring all the way down until it vanished into the molten sea below with a colossal explosion of steam and lava. For several long seconds, only the sound of rain and distant thunder remained. Seble and Steve lay gasping on the ledge, suits battered and scorched, but alive. We actually did that," Steve laughed weakly. But Slushi was not done. Shadows moved in the storm, more predators drawn by the chaos. Every hour on this planet was a fight for survival. Acid rain intensified, strange flying reptiles with electric frills circled above. The ground itself seemed to shift and rumble with geothermal fury. 40 hours remained until the wormhole reopened. 40 hours of hell. Seble clutched the container of Esist eggs tighter as they limped onward, the weight of an entire species resting on their exhausted shoulders. The red giant burned overhead like an angry eye, and somewhere in the distance more roars answered the storm. The final hours on Slushi tested every limit of human endurance. Seble and Steve limped back to their battered lander, under a sky bleeding red from the dying giant star. Acid rain had corroded sections of their nano-suits. Their bodies ached from the relentless attacks of xenomorph-like reptiles and the armoured rhino behemoth. Yet through it all, Seble never let go of the frost-covered flask containing the 20 pulsing Esist eggs, the last flickering hope of a species on the brink of extinction. With 48 hours finally elapsed, the wormhole's signature appeared on their scanners. "This is it," Steve said, firing up the lander's engines. "One shot to get home." The disc-shaped craft lifted off the volcanic island, engines screaming against the storm. Below them, the planet churned with violence. Distant explosions lighting up the horizon as Sherkan forces continued their genocidal campaign. They broke through the upper atmosphere, the red giant burning like an accusatory eye in the void. "Wormhole in range," Seble reported, but Slushi refused to let them go quietly. Alarms blared, multiple contacts, Sherkan spacecraft, sleek, angular vessels with crystalline spines glowing with geothermal power, rose from hidden orbital platforms. They were fast, heavily armed, and clearly waiting for anything trying to escape the planet. "Evasive maneuvers," Steve barked. The lander twisted violently as the first plasma lances streaked past. Seble returned fire from the defensive turret, her shots scoring hits on one attacker's wing and sending it spiraling into the planet's atmosphere in flames. But more came. The Sherkan ships moved with ruthless coordination, their weapons carving brilliant arcs through space. A direct hit rocked the lander. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit, hull integrity dropping. "They're trying to disable us," Seble shouted. Steve pushed the craft to its limits, weaving through a deadly gauntlet of energy fire. One Sherkan ship closed in dangerously, its crystalline cannons charging for a killing shot. In a desperate move, Seble overrode the lander's systems and fired a full spread of decoy drones combined with a point-blank electromagnetic pulse. The pulse scrambled the lead ship's targeting just long enough for them to break free. The shimmering wormhole mouth opened ahead like a tear in reality. "Go, go, go," Seble urged. They plunged into the wormhole at maximum thrust, the Sherkan ships still firing wildly behind them. One final energy beam from a waiting orbital satellite lanced after them, a coherent spear of destruction that followed them straight through the folding space. They emerged on the other side in a violent burst of light directly into the hangar bay of the International Space Agency's orbital station. The pursuing beam ripped through with them. Alarms screamed across the entire station. The beam slammed into the central hub, exploding in a storm of sparks, shrapnel, and decompression warnings. Bulkheads sealed. Fire suppression systems flooded corridors. The station shuddered violently as secondary explosions rippled through the structure. Seble and Steve stumbled out of the lander, the precious flask still clutched tightly between them, just as General Rice stormed into the hangar with armed security. "You damaged the station," Race roared, face purple with fury. "You nearly destroyed the wormhole gate itself, and you lost the mothership? Explain yourselves." Seble stood tall, despite her exhaustion. "We retrieved valuable biological samples, sir," she said calmly, holding up the flask. "This is one of them." Race glared at the container but didn't press further in the chaos. "Get that to the lab immediately, and both of you, debrief in 1 hour. One more failure like this and you're both finished. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," they answered in unison. Later, in the privacy of her quarters, Seble did not deliver the flask to the lab. She carefully hid it in a secure, climate-controlled compartment behind a false panel in her room, whispering softly to the glowing eggs inside. "You're safe now, for the moment." Steve stood watch at the door. "We're carrying more than just samples now. Failure isn't an option anymore." Slushi is far more than a battlefield. It is a cauldron of 6 deadly reptilian species locked in total war. The Sherkans, green-scaled conquerors, brilliant tacticians armed with crystalline technology and geothermal superweapons. They dominate the jungle continent of Sherka and seek to rule everything. The Cerasians, gigantic serpentine brutes built for raw destruction. The Shashans, cunning desert snakes, masters of deception and intricate strategy. The Mershans and Rugans, armoured crocodilian swamp warriors, savage and relentless in the mire, and the Esist, the shapeshifters, ghosts who wear the faces of their enemies to survive, now reduced to 20 fragile eggs hidden in human hands. One Esist scientist has already run the simulations. In 100 years, the Sherkans achieve total victory, total extinction for everyone else, unless these last eggs can be saved. Slushi is not just another strange planet. It is a world forged in fire and blood, where war has become the only language, and its fire may soon spill into the stars. What would you do if you carried the last hope of a dying species on your shoulders while the galaxy itself seems determined to crush you? Drop your thoughts below. If you want to know what happens next, the desperate infiltration of Sherka, the shapeshifter's final gamble, and whether Sebele's growing abilities can protect the eggs, subscribe and hit the bell. The universe is far deadlier than we imagined. This has been Strangest Planets. See you on the next world. They had barely touched down on a narrow strip of volcanic glass near the coastline when the ground betrayed them. A deep, guttural rumble rolled through the earth. The lander rocked violently. "Seismic activity!" Steve shouted, gripping the controls. The quake hit like a hammer from the gods. The black rock beneath them split open with a deafening crack. Fissures raced across the landing zone like lightning. Seble and Steve sprinted out of the craft just as the entire plateau began to rise. The ground itself was lifting, an enormous tectonic plate groaning upward into the sky at terrifying speed. Rock and ash cascaded around them as the platform surged higher and higher, hundreds of meters in seconds. The lander slid backward, tilting dangerously before vanishing over the newly formed cliff edge. "Hold on!" Steve yelled, grabbing Seble's arm as they scrambled for purchase on the rising slope. The ascent finally slowed and stopped with a bone-jarring lurch. They now stood on a sheer, newly formed cliff thousands of feet above the roiling ocean below. The drop was catastrophic. Even their advanced nano-suits couldn't guarantee survival from that height. The impact forces would be overwhelming. Seble looked down, wind whipping her helmet. No way down, the walls are almost vertical. Steve scanned the cliff face. No handholds. If we fall, we're paced. The planet was not finished with them. From orbit it had looked like an emerald veiled in golden smoke, a world of impossible geology where the very crust seemed alive. Now they understood why. This was a shifting world, a planet in constant tectonic torment. Massive supercontinents drifted and collided at accelerated speeds. Entire landmasses rose and fell like breathing lungs. Rivers of molten stone fed into one colossal, dark ocean that dominated the hemisphere like a living heart. Strange life exploded around them in hyperspeed. Plants burst from cracks in the rock, bloomed in seconds with iridescent flowers, released clouds of glowing spores, then collapsed into nutrient-rich mulch. Flocks of glass-winged creatures wheeled overhead, screeching as if warning the ground itself was untrustworthy. The explorers had no choice but to move along the narrow ridge of the risen plateau, searching for any possible descent. The wind howled. Distant volcanoes erupted in unison, painting the golden clouds blood red. Then the ground trembled again. A new fissure opened directly beneath them. Steve grabbed Seble and dove forward as the rock behind them sheared away, plummeting into the abyss. They crawled desperately across unstable ground, the cliff edge crumbling under their hands and knees. "Steve, the lander," Seble pointed. Far below, half buried in fresh lava flows, their disc-shaped craft lay wrecked and smoking. The rising plateau had torn it from its landing zone and dropped it into the volcanic chaos. "We're stranded," Steve said grimly. Worse was coming. As they inched along the precarious ridge, the planet's hyper-evolution turned against them. Carnivorous vines erupted from the rock, whipping toward them with thorned tendrils. Seble slashed at them with her combat knife, while Steve provided covering fire. One vine wrapped around his ankle, yanking him toward the edge. Seble severed it just in time, pulling him back from the drop. The golden clouds above began to swirl violently. A massive atmospheric pressure shift triggered a sudden storm, howling winds mixed with superheated ash and exotic gases that made their suit filters scream in protest. They finally reached a narrow, crumbling natural bridge connecting to a lower plateau. The bridge was barely wide enough for one person. Below it, a river of molten stone flowed sluggishly toward the dark ocean. Halfway across, the bridge began to collapse. "Run!" Steve roared. They sprinted as the stone disintegrated beneath their boots. Seble leaped the final gap, rolling across the far side. Steve jumped a split second later, grabbing her outstretched hand as the last section fell away into the lava. They collapsed on the far plateau, gasping for breath inside their suits. But the shifting world had one more surprise. In the distance, a new volcanic island was literally rising from the super ocean. Steam and fire exploding upward as fresh land was born in real time. The entire planet was a living engine of creation and destruction. Seble clutched the side of the cliff, staring at the impossible vista. "We came for answers," she whispered, "but this world doesn't give answers. It only changes the question." Steve looked at their distant, ruined lander and the hostile, ever-shifting landscape surrounding them. 48 hours until the wormhole reopens, he said, "if this planet doesn't kill us first." The ground rumbled again beneath them, as if laughing at their defiance. And somewhere, in the golden clouds above, new storms were already forming. Exhausted and battered from the rising plateau, Seble and Steve descended into a vast, blinding white expanse, an endless salt flat that stretched in every direction under the brutal sun. At first glance it looked manageable. A distant mountain range shimmered on the horizon like a promise of safety and higher ground. "We can cross this in a couple of hours," Steve said, wiping sweat from his brow inside his helmet. "Easy." They started walking. Hours passed. The mountain never got closer. What they had mistaken for a modest salt plain was an optical illusion on a planetary scale. The flat was unimaginably massive, a shimmering white desert of crystallized minerals that reflected the sun with merciless intensity. Their suits' cooling systems strained under the glare. The air shimmered with heat haze, turning the world into a disorienting mirage. Every step crunched on salt that looked like snow, but burned like fire when it found gaps in their suits. "We've been walking for 6 hours," Seble said, voice tight. "That mountain should be right in front of us." Steve checked their suits' inertial navigation. "We've covered nearly 40 kilometers. It's still the same distance away. This whole plane is playing tricks on us." Dehydration set in faster than expected. Their water recyclers couldn't keep up with the extreme heat and exertion. Hallucinations began at the edges of their vision, phantom oases, moving shadows, the distant echo of their own lander's engines. Strange salt formations rose like twisted sculptures, some resembling ancient alien statues that seemed to watch them as they passed. Night finally fell, bringing a temporary drop in temperature, but no relief. They collapsed on the hard salt crust, backs against each other for security, watching alien stars wheel overhead through the golden clouds. Bioluminescent microbes in the salt glowed faintly around them, creating an eerie, ghostly carpet of light. Sleep was restless, haunted by the constant low rumbling of the ever-shifting planet. Dawn brought new horror. The mountain was still far away. They walked for several more agonizing hours under the rising sun, legs burning, throats parched, until they finally staggered into the foothills. The ground here was unstable, fractured by fresh fissures and new volcanic vents. Steam rose from cracks in the earth, but their ordeal was only beginning. They reached the edge of a deep gorge where they had last seen signs of their original lander. Far below, half buried in rock and fresh mud, the silver hull lay crushed and broken. Before they could even process the loss, the tide from the great dark ocean surged inward with terrifying speed. Churning black waves flooded the gorge, swallowing the wreckage in moments. "No, no, no!" Steve's voice cracked with despair, hands pressed against his helmet. Seble tried her comm again. "Control, this is Seble and Steve. Do you copy?" Only thick static answered. The dense, hostile atmosphere swallowed their signal completely. They were truly cut off from any hope of immediate rescue. Seble's voice remained steel. "Then we survive. That's what we were trained for." Above them, glass-winged creatures screamed as if mocking their plight. The planet was alive, restless, and hungry. The first drops of rain hissed against Seble's suit, At first, they thought it was salvation. Then the droplets struck the rocks with sharp, sizzling pops, releasing white smoke, acid rain. The downpour intensified into a burning deluge. Their suits' integrity warnings flashed red as the corrosive liquid ate away at the outer layers. They sprinted desperately along the gorge rim, searching for shelter. A dark cave mouth appeared in the cliff face ahead. They dove inside just as the storm reached its peak, the acid rain roaring like a waterfall outside. Inside the cave, a strange glow greeted them. In the center lay a shimmering pool of liquid that pulsed with impossible colors, emerald, crimson, and liquid gold. It rippled as though alive, casting hypnotic patterns across the walls. "Beautiful," Seble whispered, stepping closer. Steve grabbed her wrist. "Don't. The readings are off the charts. That's pure acid. It would eat through our suits in seconds." Even beauty on this world was lethal. They waited out the storm in tense silence. When they finally emerged, the planet had shifted again. What had been a cave at ground level was now perched high on a newly raised hill. The shifting world had rearranged itself overnight. "We climb," Steve said. "Higher ground, better chance at a signal." They scaled the unstable slope, rocks crumbling beneath their boots, fresh fissures opening without warning. At the summit, Steve tried the comm once more. "Control, this is Team Delta. Do you copy?" Static. Then a faint reply. "Delta, we read you. Coordinates locked. Dispatching rescue lander." Relief washed over them. From their vantage, they watched a new disc-shaped lander descend through the golden clouds. From their vantage, they watched a new disc-shaped lander descend through the golden clouds toward the shoreline. It touched down gracefully on the dark sand. But as they began their careful descent toward it, the ground trembled violently once more. A new volcanic vent erupted nearby, sending a fountain of molten rock skyward. The planet was not ready to release them. Seble and Steve ran toward their only hope of escape as the shifting world continued its endless, merciless transformation around them. The rescue lander's engines hummed with promise, but Dalol, as the explorers had begun calling this restless world, had one final betrayal in store. Seble stood on the ridge, watching the disc-shaped craft settle on the dark shoreline below. Relief flooded her, for the first time in days. Then her eyes drifted to the horizon. "Steve." Her voice tightened with dread. "The ocean." The murky, oil-black sea was rising, not gradually but violently, as if the entire planet were inhaling. Massive waves surged forward, clawing at the beach with unnatural speed. The water level climbed dozens of meters in seconds, drawn upward by some colossal tectonic shift deep beneath the superocean. "Move!" Steve roared. They threw themselves down the unstable slope in a desperate sliding sprint. Freshly formed rocks crumbled beneath their boots. Loose gravel turned into miniature avalanches. Behind them, the roar of rushing water grew into a thunderous wall of sound. The rescue lander's legs were already knee-deep in the surging tide. When they reached it, Seble vaulted onto the lowering ramp, nearly slipping on the wet metal. Steve shoved her forward with all his strength before hauling himself up after her, the dark water lapping at his heels. The hatch slammed shut just as a massive wave crashed against the side of the craft, rocking it violently. "Lift off! Now!" Steve yelled at the pilot controls. The lander's engines screamed in protest as it tore free from the grasping sea. Through the viewport, they watched the beach and the entire coastline disappear beneath churning black waves. Another section of the ever-shifting continent was swallowed in real time. Inside the cockpit, both explorers collapsed into their seats helmets fogged, chests heaving. Adrenaline still pounded through their veins. "We barely made it," Seble whispered, clutching the armrest. "This planet doesn't just change, it consumes." The journey back to orbit was tense, the lander fighting through turbulent golden clouds and sudden atmospheric pressure spikes. When they finally docked with the main ship, the silence of the station felt almost alien. Back in the debriefing room, General Rice's face filled the large screen. At first, he was all sharp smiles. "Excellent work on Dalol. The preliminary scans show resources beyond imagination, rare minerals, exotic gases. That massive ocean alone could fuel entire fleets. The agency is impressed." Then his expression darkened. "But you abandoned the mission after barely 1 day on the surface. 48 hours of planned exploration reduced to a panicked retreat. Where are the detailed samples? Where is the comprehensive data? You risked a lander and came back with almost nothing." Seble stepped forward, her voice steady, but edged with exhaustion. "With respect, sir, that planet is fundamentally unstable. The ground rises and falls overnight. Acid rain corrodes suits in minutes. Entire land masses are born and drowned while you watch. We couldn't risk staying longer or sending a second lander. It would have been suicide." "Incompetence is what I'm hearing," Race snapped, slamming his hand on the console. "If you can't handle one unpredictable world, I'll send Team Alpha. They'll do the job properly and bring back everything we need." Steve's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. Race leaned closer to the camera, eyes cold. "Rest up. You leave in 24 hours for your next assignment. Dismissed." The screen went dark. In the quiet corridor outside, Seble and Steve stood shoulder to shoulder, staring out at the blue curve of Earth far below. Seble finally spoke, her voice low. "Dalol wasn't just a planet, it was a warning, a living reminder that some worlds are too volatile, too alive, to conquer." Steve nodded grimly, the weight of their narrow escape still heavy on his shoulders. "And nobody up here is listening." Far behind them, across the wormhole, the shifting world continued its endless dance. New mountains rose from the superocean, fresh acid storms swept across salt flats. Glass-winged creatures screamed into the golden clouds as another continent crumbled, and a new one was born in fire. Some planets are not meant to be explored. They are meant to remind us how small we truly are.